And it's a great pleasure to help out with the book launch for Alex Meleagrou-Hitchens' great new book on Anwar al-Awlaki, on incitement, Anwar al-Awlaki's Western Jihad. I wrote a book about this guy some years back, and he remains a fascinating character to me. And so it's an honor to be asked by Alex to throw some questions at him. We'll be doing this for an hour or maybe a little bit longer. And if you have a question that you want to send in at any point, you'll see a Q&A box down at the bottom right of your screen. And you can send us a question, and in the latter part of this event, we will, Alex will answer some of them. So to start us off, why don't, Alex is the, as I'm sure many of you know, is the research director of the great program on extremism at George Washington University, which has become a kind of go-to resource for many people studying this topic. So why don't we start by asking how you came to take an interest in Anwar al-Awlaki, and maybe you can fill us in a little bit on your background as you explain that.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Scott. Thanks for doing this. We've been in touch over the years with this shared interest when you're at the New York Times in particular, and your articles about al-Awlaki back in the 2000s and in the last decade were incredibly useful for me, as is your book, Objective Choice. So it is as well my real pleasure to have you doing this. So al-Awlaki probably came across my radar, I'd say, in around 2007. I had just started as sort of junior researcher, looking at sort of Islamist activism and jihadism in the UK in particular. And as I was getting to know the individuals and the networks in the UK, this name just kept coming up as a reference, or as a speaker who was being hosted at this point from Yemen, where he was. He'd also spent some time in the UK, at least a year, in the early 2000s, so he was this known figure. And it just became clear to me by the end of the last decade, so around 08, 09, that this guy was perhaps the most influential speaker for a range of different activists, from sort of Islamist activists, so people who were not necessarily jihadi but had an overall worldview that you could define as Islamist, and for jihadists. So he was having this wide appeal, and I just started following everything he was saying and doing, getting to know the people who were his followers, and even attending events where he was being screened through a sort of live stream in London mosques and
you actually heard him speaking live?
Yes,
wow.
At one community center.
Mm-hmm.
And actually got to know about him so well that I ended up at the think tank I was working at the time. We actually spent time trying to get the authorities to become more aware of the fact that there was this guy who by this point was pretty much preaching jihad, who was being beamed through live streams into British Muslim institutions and mosques. And he was even running Islamic courses through video at a community center in South London, which I cover in the book. And I interview people who were involved with trying to get that stopped, who were involved with it going ahead. So it was just this kind of, and it slowly became an obsession, I guess. And that manifested into me doing a PhD on him at King's College from 2010 to around 2014. And slowly that then kind of became this book, which has taken a sort of a criminal amount of time to publish, mostly my fault.
This is a guy who spent almost exactly half of his 40 years that he lived in the US and half abroad, most of that in Yemen. But why don't you, and it's interesting that you call this his Western Jihad. Why don't you walk us through his somewhat unusual biography and tell us, what his connections were to Yemen, what his connections were to the US and to the UK?
Yeah. Well, look, I think one of the things I mentioned early on is the biographical story of al-Awlaki had kind of been done, and largely by yourself. There was already a very good biography of him, and so while there is some components of biography in the book, it's actually, I say, mostly presented as an intellectual history, so an attempt to map his own ideological evolution, place him within wider Islamic traditions, particularly ones that were emerging in the West, and then as well as understanding his own intellectual history, explaining how and why he was such an effective communicator of jihadism to Westerners. And that's what the book tries to do. So, we can start with al-Awlaki's early career in Colorado. He was a preacher there at at least one small local mosque. And very soon into his work, it became clear to at least a few people that he had an ability. He was doing things that Western Islamic preachers weren't really doing at the time, and this actually partly explains his popularity. He was basically almost all of his early work, things that people may be familiar with, the lives of the prophets, life of Muhammad, pretty much most of the things that he was famous for early on in that time were what are referred to as sirah, which is basically historical accounts of mostly the prophet, but also his companions. And they are not hadith, which are essentially the second most important primary text in Islam. They are actually less reliable than hadith. They are historical accounts which bring together a lot of different sources and present a story of periods of time in Muhammad's history. And that's pretty much all his work really was. It was these translations of previously existing histories into English, and also not just translating them into English, but presenting them to a Western audience, making them relevant to Westerners. And speaking to a lot of pretty influential Islamic preachers in America, people like Yasir Qadhi and others, many of them told me, look, no one had done this before. No one in America in English was translating these sirah and making them so widely available. So that's really what he was doing. He got the attention of Saudi businessmen who essentially managed to package his lectures very effectively and get them out there.
Yes, and so he became sort of, at least in the small world of Islamic bookstores in the U.S. and abroad, sort of the best-selling, sort of a bestseller on CD. This is a guy who always kind of grabbed the latest technology for reaching his audience. And, these were for essentially the Islamic equivalent of Bible stories that he was elaborating on, right? Stories that you might take from the Old Testament or something, of battles and heroes. And he had a knack for storytelling in that way, right?
Yes, and the storytelling is a big part of his overall success, which I can get into later. And, you have to really understand al-Awlaki. You have to understand Islam in America at the time and how it was being disseminated, particularly conservative Islam in America, let's say. And really at the time, the way it would work was there'd be the odd conference, usually somewhere on the East Coast or on the West Coast, California, DC, New York, New Jersey. And these were conferences where people would congregate, and a lot of preachers would disseminate their word. They would sell it. Usually it was audio tapes back then, recorded audio tapes. And you would go to these conferences. I spoke to people who worked for the company that produced al-Awlaki's stuff, the al-Bashir publication. And they said, look, the way most of this stuff looked was really sort of raggedy, old tapes in sort of unmarked cases being sort of passed around from someone's boot, or at a shabby stall at a conference. Hamadan al-Turki, this head of this Saudi businessman who set up al-Bashir, completely revolutionized that whole industry through al-Awlaki. And he not only got it on CD, he packaged it. The actual packaging of the CD was really professional, really high budget. And the stall itself was the best looking stall in the place. So there was this big marketing push behind it from someone who saw the charisma and the potential this guy had. So just purely from those kind of logistical parts of how Islam was presented in America at the time, he was very quick to become the best known, the best disseminated.
So at that time, he was, why don't we think of this guy now as a leader of al-Qaeda, a leading voice for al-Qaeda. Someone who endorsed violence, someone who was a major terrorist. that back then, that's not who he was. But why don't you try to place him in the kind of world of Western Islam, of American Islam, ideologically at that time? Was he a radical?
Yeah. No, I don't think I'd put him down as a radical. I think, again, I'll give you a quick overview of what Islam looked like when al-Awlaki emerged and where we can place him. Yeah, part of what the book does is it tracks his evolution across a spectrum of what we can roughly describe as Salafi thought and activism. He sort of physically, he presented as a Salafi, the way he dressed, in the kind of the robes and the type of beard he had. He presented himself as a Salafi. And what I argue essentially is, in the US, there were Salafism emerged in the US some point I've managed to kind of identify in the late 70s, early 80s. And without getting too much detail, the form of Salafism that America initially had was what you call quietist, non-political, non-activist Salafism that was very concerned with really very in-depth study of Quran, Hadith, no real engagement with politics or the outside world, really, or the outside society or geopolitics or any of that. In fact, that was sort of frowned on. It is, they were taking their line from a handful of Saudi sheikhs, the establishment Saudi sheikhs, and they were transmitting all of that type of Salafism into America. And it was done through an organization called the Quran and Sunnah Society. I spoke to a lot of people who were members of that movement, or that group, who have since moved on or are still in it. And really the request was, you're going to come and you're going to study with us. We're going to have conferences, but we're going to create a very closed community, and we're not going to engage with politics or activism.
And how did those guys see Anwar at the time?
So one of the really revealing things is there was early evidence of them really being wary of him and not trusting him. He was not in that QSS American Salafism, the Quran and Sunnah Society, which was essentially this quietist Salafi movement. If we were to think of Salafism divided into three categories, very simply: quietist, activist, jihadist. There's a lot of detail in that, but I can't really, we don't have the time for it now. But in America, the quietism came through QSS. Soon in the 90s, a new organization emerged called the Islamic Association of North America, IANA. That was seen as the American iteration of activist Salafism. These were essentially Salafis who were also engaging in politics, who were engaging in the wide world, who were discussing, what's going on with Muslims in Palestine, what's going on with the quietists were saying, ignore all that, don't think about fighting jihad when you haven't learned the Quran inside out. There's no point. The activists are saying, actually, no, we need to employ methods that involve some type of activism, some type of engagement with the outside world. But still, a lot of study as well required. It was still quite an in-depth intellectual, theologically focused movement. Al-Awlaki emerges with IANA and QSS sort of vying for influence and attention, and he kind of offers this new way, which is, it's not quietist because it is really engaging with politics and society, and it's fusing Islamic theology with all that, or making it relevant to that. It's also not, it's activist, but it's not Salafi activist in the way IANA were, in that it wasn't doing there was no real in-depth Quranic study. As I said, his work is almost entirely these narrative accounts that are very engaging and very well translated. So al-Awlaki managed to kind of offer this third version of Salaf, of a sort of light Salafism. In fact, Johari Abdul Malik, who was at the Dar al-Hijra Mosque for many years, who I think you also interviewed, described to me the first time that al-Awlaki in that way. He said he's Salafi light. He was relying on the kind of sources Salafis rely on, but he wasn't going in depth on issues of creed and theology and method. And this really made him a unique proposition for a lot of people. So
now this was a big, Dar al-Hijra that you just mentioned is the big mosque in Falls Church, Virginia, right across the Potomac from Washington, where he got quite a following, was quite a successful young kind of hotshot imam. And then along comes 9/11. And some of our audience may be old enough to remember, that Anwar al-Awlaki got quite a bit of attention from the FBI because two of the hijackers had been in his mosque prayed at his mosque in San Diego. And after he moved to Washington, to Falls Church, Virginia, a third showed up. And so they kind of wondered, what was the connection there? So, take us from what happened after 9/11 to his departure and his life overseas.
Yeah, so the fact he was at Dar al-Hijra allows us to place him a little bit further. So there are many different types of mosques in America, and they're fairly identifiable for Muslims as well as for people who are studying it. You have Salafi mosques that are very specifically Salafi, that they are usually quite close to the Saudi kingdom and the Saudi sheikhs. They present physically in the ways you'd imagine. And you sometimes have what you would more closely associate with the Muslim Brotherhood or sort of Islamist-inspired mosques. The Dar al-Hijra mosque is not considered a Salafi mosque. It is really an Islamist, or at least a sort of Muslim Brotherhood influenced mosque, certainly founded by Muslim Brotherhood exiles. And so the fact that al-Awlaki was at that mosque was, for a lot of people, a sign, and this is coming from American Muslims I spoke to and people who even attended Dar al-Hijra. They said, look, you don't go to Dar al-Hijra unless you have influence from Ikhwan, if you have Islamist influence in your thinking. We don't just hire Salafis who don't get involved in Islamism. So al-Awlaki kind of represented this fusion in America of components of Salafi theology and dress and presentation with sort of Islamist activism. So I place him in somewhere in this category of Salafi activism in America. 9/11 happens. He becomes one of the go-to voices for journalists looking to hear more about Islam. I mean, let's not forget, today we all know, people know about the religion a lot more than they did back then. When 9/11 happened, the idea of Islam was still quite a mystery for a lot of people. I was in my teens. I went to a fairly multicultural school. I had a fairly good idea, but it was not by any means something anyone really knew much about. And so there was this really sort of this attempt to find the guy who can link this all together, and al-Awlaki was that. And he, was interviewed and became this public figure, and he was fairly critical of al-Qaeda and received a lot of attention and praise as a result. But one of the things the book does is the first couple sections are divided in sort of his early work and his later work. And his early work, really at this time, had small clues in it about the influences that he was under and the direction he may go in, depending on how events unfold. And one of the things that becomes very clear is, as well as relying on Sirah, so the histories, particularly of Muhammad, he was a pretty big fan of Sayyid Qutb and Abu Maududi, who are two key Islamist thinkers, senior member of the Muslim Brotherhood, Qutb, and former leader of it, and Abu Allah Maududi, founder of the Jamaat Islami. Sort of.
And this was all already while he was in the U.S.?
Yes. So there were things he was saying and quotes he was using that were coming straight. And one of the first big flags for me early on when I was listening to his work, again, the work that's considered kind of mainstream, is his endorsement of the Qutbist version of Jahiliyyah, or the idea that the world is in a state of ignorance today because it is not being run by Islamic law. He was using a Qutbist interpretation of Jahiliyyah very early on in his career. And there was a number of other examples in that early work where he was using, again, sources that one could only have found in jihadist work. Probably the most important was his, and this is where a lot of the quietest Salafis I spoke to, who didn't trust al-Awlaki really early on in that time, because they all kept saying to me, you can see all this Islamist influence in his work. And of course, Salafis have their own reasons not to like or trust Islamists that we can't let ourselves be too influenced by. But they would repeatedly say to me that the guy was justifying suicide bombing in the 90s and the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And I was told this by a lot of different American Salafis who were at the time very worried about him, and saying, we kept hearing that. And yes, look, and the way he justified suicide bombings was the way it had just recently at the time been justified by a guy called Yusuf al-Uyayri, a very important Saudi al-Qaeda member and jihadist ideologue. And very quickly, Uyayri said suicide bombings are legitimate, and he took a couple of stories from the Hadith to prove this, one of which is the story of the king and the boy, which I can't go into now. But al-Awlaki was reliant on that king and the boy story in the early 2000s and the late 90s to say, look, this is actually a justification for suicide bombing. Not telling anyone to go do it, but saying that kind of stuff early on meant that when 9/11 happened and the jihad movement emerged, this new option emerged for al-Awlaki as well. And I think that he kind of gravitated towards it as other options perhaps sort of dissipated. And the thing about activist Salafis, unlike the quietists, is that the quietists, whatever happens outside in the world, their belief, their aqidah, their creed, their ideology doesn't change, nor does their methodology. How they practice Islam is not influenced by geopolitics at any point. Activist Salafis, to some extent, their methodologies are subject to the sort of undulations of geopolitics. So as the world changed and the war on terror emerged, you actually did see a lot of activist Salafis move to jihadism, two of which were in America, Anwar al-Awlaki, one of them, and his predecessor, essentially Ali al-Tamimi from Northern Virginia.
I was going to say that I remember during that period, after 9/11, as you mentioned, a lot of American media kind of rushed to this speaker of American English who was also native in Arabic and was very good at explaining things. And the Washington Post did a video that you can still find on the web in which Anwar al-Awlaki, this later leader of al-Qaeda, in his basement and in his little house in Falls Church, explains Ramadan to the Americans. But even then, he was, when he condemned the 9/11 attacks, he always tried to balance it and say, just as it's wrong for America to be bombing, women and children in Afghanistan, it was wrong for al-Qaeda to attack on 9/11. So he was always, doing this sort of balancing act at that time. So he leaves the U.S. in 2002, and what happens? Where's he going?
So he leaves the U.S. under a bit of a number of clouds, which we might get into later. But he leaves the U.S. angry, firstly. What had happened in the U.S. at that time, after 9/11, a lot of federal agencies turned their attention to Islamic activism and practice in the United States. And one major operation that took place while al-Awlaki was still in Northern Virginia was this operation to shut down a number of Islamic charities that were accused by the FBI and other federal agencies of funding groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And there was a lot of door knocking down and people being roughed up and arrested, at least. And al-Awlaki saw this as the first step America was taking in a really increased effort to destroy Islam. And one of the last speeches he gave at Dar al-Hijra before he goes to the UK is to say, look, this event is proof to you that this war on Islam that I've been warning. And again, the idea of a war on Islam was in his work right from the start. The idea of the West as an inherent threat to Muslims and Islam from the start in his work. It was not the culture, the Western culture of America and globalization, all that was not seen as a benign thing. It was seen as a metastatic threat to Islam and Islamic identity. And it was an attempt to kind of ruin all that. So he viewed all of this. So he leaves America after giving this very impassioned speech, and he goes to the UK. And again, the book maps as well as mapping out what American Islam looked like at the time of al-Awlaki's time in America. It looks a little bit at Islamic activism in the UK when al-Awlaki goes. And really, it's, as I described, it's a fairly dark period in the sort of short history of the relationship between British Muslims and the state and wider society. We were gearing up toward, we were already in Afghanistan. There was a lot of attention on Muslims anyway. 9/11 had happened. We were a couple of years away from the 7/7 attacks, 2005. And we were gearing up to get into Iraq. And London famously is the venue of one of the biggest protests in the history of the city against the Iraq war. So there's a lot of mobilization against it, and so there was a lot of opportunity for Islamist activist organizations to really inflame things and create divisions and recruit on the back of it. And so Islamist activism in the UK when al-Awlaki went there was really brazen. And there's a few quotes in it in the book from the kind of stuff mainstream Islamist organizations were saying back then, and things like threatening to stop cooperating with the police if certain demands weren't met, making claims that wanting to establish a caliphate was a legitimate mainstream Islamic belief, all this kind of stuff. And it was an angry time.
That was quite different from the world that he'd left in America, right?
Yep.
Muslims were sort of on the defensive after 9/11. And they knew they were being watched very carefully, and if anything, it was sort of a rally around the American mainstream for Muslims to kind of keep from being singled out and attacked. But he gets to the UK and he finds a much more an atmosphere that's much more hospitable to sort of radicalism, right?
Yes, as I say, aggressive Islamist activism, big time open support for defensive jihad at the very least, sort of saying that if the UK invades Iraq, it'll be justified for British soldiers to be killed. And this was, these were things that were going on. And I would just read you a statement given out by the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, which is today mainstream, solid organization. It's sort of an umbrella group for all the student Islamic societies in the UK. At the time, al-Awlaki, they were big fans of al-Awlaki. When he came to England, they hosted him around a lot of universities, including the one I work at, King's College. And this is a statement they put out, and I'll just read part of it. It's essentially saying that Muslims are being demonized. Whereas previously it was Muslims themselves under attack, now the agenda is to attack Islam. Its principles and values, as well as its political system of Sharia and Khilafah, are under attack. Again, this is a student Islamic organization saying that the idea of Islam as a political system and the idea that a caliphate should be established is a completely straightforward mainstream idea. Now, in the age of ISIS, that really is quite a shocking thing. Imagine a student Islamic society saying that today. That's the kind of stuff they were saying then. And so, yes, this is the atmosphere he comes into, and he really helps rile it up even more. And he gives a couple of pretty inflammatory speeches, including one at a very influential mosque in London called the East London Mosque. It's a mosque that is openly influenced by the Jamaat-e-Islami and hands out books by Abu al-Maududi. Handed one to me when I visited them years ago. And he gives a speech where there'd been this big event in the UK, and it was a heavy-handed police action, undoubtedly, on a guy called Babar Ahmed, who'd been arrested and sort of roughed up by the police on suspicion of terrorism. And a huge campaign group emerged out of that, which, again, I think it was fair enough to an extent. The police ended up having to pay compensation for the campaign emerges called Stop Police Terror. And part of the campaign is what I mentioned already, was this threat. They said, if your police don't stop terrorizing Muslims, so arresting terror suspects, if in bold, the police do not stop, we will stop cooperating. Al-Awlaki gives a speech at the campaign at the East London Mosque where essentially he presents a war on Islam that's happening in the UK. So again, one of the key things about al-Awlaki was, okay, it's one thing to say there's a war on Islam taking place, but one of the things al-Awlaki had to do was personalize that war on Islam for Westerners. Because at that point, war on Islam meant Iraq war, Israel-Palestine, Afghanistan. It's not hard to sell the war on Islam to an Afghan who's got bombs dropping all around him or whose family were just killed. Harder to sell the war on Islam to fairly well-off and relatively happy Muslims in Western countries. So a big part of his job was to make war on Islam a reality to Americans and Britons by using examples from things that were happening in the country. And he took a number of examples, including the Babar Ahmed one, and other recent things. There were attempts by the British government to extend the amount of time you could hold someone on terror charges or on terror suspicion without charge. All this stuff was in the news. He knew it was in the concerns and the psyche of his audience, and he played it up to say, look, actually, the clouds are forming around being Muslim in the West, and I'm going to give you all these examples of why you're under threat. So he does that. He also,
Alex, let me just interrupt for one sec to tell those who didn't hear me say this before, that if you have a question, you can click on the Q&A button down the lower right of your screen and write a question for us. And in the latter part of this presentation, we will turn to those questions, and Alex will answer as many as we have time for. So what happened to al-Awlaki's output at that time in those years when he was in the UK, and then when he moved to Yemen after a year or two in the UK? Yep. What was he continuing? He was sort of this bestseller of box sets of stories of the prophets and so on. What had happened to his output, and was he finding an audience beyond the basement of the East London Mosque?
So, as well as these quite inflammatory political speeches he was giving at very influential Islamic centers and universities around the country, he also started translating stuff. And the first thing he translates is something called the Book of Jihad, which bit of a red flag, I suppose, on the face of it. It's actually a medieval text by a guy called Ibn Nuhas, and it's a justification for physical violent jihad in that era. Strangely enough, it's not considered a very important text. You know, it's not considered a key thing that needs to be translated. It's important for jihadists, but it's not something that has a much wider intellectual or academic value. Yet he chooses at that time in the UK to translate this and give it modern relevance. And again, speaking to people who attended the events, in fact, a former, at the time, an MI6 agent who had gone and attended the event, who realized he was sitting in an event where al-Awlaki was translating the Book of Jihad with 2 of the future 7-7 bombers in the meeting. So that's the kind of people who were already attracted to him back then. Mm-hmm. So the decision to translate Book of Jihad at all was very suspicious. And a lot of Salafis at the time in the UK, non-jihadis or anti-jihadist, anti-Islamist Salafis, were really worried about these meetings al-Awlaki kept holding and translating Book of Jihad in, and were warning everyone they could about it. So that's the first big sign that he's taking another step, which is making important jihadist ideological works not just make sense to Westerners and sort of and giving them references that are relevant to their lives, but are accessible in English to them in ways that were never before. So he translates that in the UK, and really all the you can hear, it's all audio, by the way. This is all audio or video mostly. All the vast majority of his work was AV, not written. And Book of Jihad is that. And pretty much soon after that, he goes to Yemen in 2004. And yeah, I mean, we can go on about. I don't know if you had any questions about that or.
Well, I wonder when he left the UK. My recollection is that he kind of had money problems. He didn't really have a profession that he was being paid for in the UK. He, of course, had family, his extended family. His father was a very prominent member of Yemeni society, a former government minister and chancellor of 2 different universities. So, he's from a prominent family. So he was getting back to that. But do you have any sense that he was he was headed for Yemen in part because there was an al-Qaeda branch there, and he already was thinking about that?
Very not clear. There was certainly a friend of his in the UK I spoke to who said that there were things al-Awlaki was saying to him that were suspicious, that he said, there's some sheikhs in Yemen I want to go speak to, and he wasn't very clear. But, that I couldn't really get more than that. Things moved sort of not that quickly, I suppose, for me. It was in Yemen from 2004, spent time in prison, and then kind of came out. I think it was a couple of years before he ended up actually joining the AQAP. But in that interim, other major things happen. And again, 2005, in Yemen, he translates Constance on the Path of Jihad. So that was really the next step from Book of Jihad, was Constance on the Path of Jihad, written by Yusuf al-Uyairi, a modern jihadist text, very important one, and one which al-Awlaki again takes it on himself to translate for Westerners. And this time, there's no pretense about it being an academic exercise. It's an attempt to say, look, you guys need to read this and understand what is so important, how to fight jihad, and how it will never, as the title suggests, it will never end until the day of judgment. So you can never really stop fighting it. And again, it wasn't just translating it, it was repackaging it, reframing it so that references were for Westerners, not for a Middle Eastern audience.
How did he get it out?
Key thing
How did he distribute it at that time?
So again, one of the things we were talking about early on was his adoption of technology throughout. And now it seems such an obvious thing to say, but at the time it was still not all that normal for sheikhs like him or preachers like him to use sort of live streaming or YouTube or any type of sort of forum uploads. Constance on the Path of Jihad, again, audio translation, recorded and then disseminated. I don't know how the original one came out. I think it was just an audio file uploaded onto YouTube and onto various forums. Again, quite mainstream Islamic forum.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we're gonna we're going to, we got to leave some time for questions here. So fast forwarding a bit, he obviously connects with al-Qaeda, with the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the sort of Saudi Yemeni branch of al-Qaeda, finds his sort of spiritual home, and it's actually in Shabwa, the province that his family is originally from. He leaves Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, moves out to the boondocks, to sort of family homes, and connects with al-Qaeda. So he's made this whole journey from denouncing 9/11, from the pulpit, so to speak, in the U.S., to becoming more and more openly extremist in his talk. And of course, the world's changing at the time. The U.S. Invades Afghanistan after 9/11, then the U.S. invades Iraq, and there's plenty of evidence for what al-Awlaki has talked about as this war on Islam. And he ends up literally a spokesman for al-Qaeda, a leader of a sort in the al-Qaeda branch, and a leader of jihad, becomes extremely influential. And so you say in the book, you did the analysis, and by your count, you found that his inspiration or his influence could be found in at least 66 of 212 people accused of jihadist crimes in the United States. That's really remarkable. To what do you attribute, here's this guy off in the wilds of Yemen, to what do you attribute his enormous influence on American Muslims, on European Muslims, in terms of luring them into jihadist violence?
Yeah, so one of the things that I point out in the book, I present him along in this sort of pantheon of Western jihadist preachers. He wasn't the first, and he's not the last, but he's the most important, and I'll say why in a moment. But we have others, Abu Hamza al-Masri in the UK, and Jim Chowdhury in the UK, Ali al-Tamimi, Abdullah al-Faisal. There are a lot of others, but the one that al-Awlaki did that these others didn't was he started his career as a very influential, a seemingly mainstream preacher, endorsed by all these mainstream and very, very important organizations. But unlike other jihadist English speakers like Abdullah al-Faisal, those guys only spoke about jihad. That's all they did. They took everything they could from the Quran, the Hadith, and they focused everything on fighting jihad. Al-Awlaki did a huge amount of work that didn't talk about jihad at all. All the Sirah work and all these other discussions that he offered. So he was firstly able to, but when he started talking about jihad, he was able to present fighting jihad as part of the wider Islamic sort of project in a way that the other guys could be easily dismissed by mainstream Muslims and say, look, these guys, all they do is talk about jihad. It's all they're interested in. This guy that wasn't the same with him. He was talking about a lot of other things, and then brings jihad into the conversation and presents it as just a natural part of Islam. So there's that part of it that no others had that wider mainstream credibility beforehand. And I think that's, pretty much a key reason. I use a sort of theoretical framework to analyze al-Awlaki's work based on social movement theory. Social movement theory essentially is a collection of theories that try to explain how and why people get involved in collective action, or what they call contentious politics. And that is basically protests, any type of collective action, and that can go all the way up to actual acts of terrorism. What I argue is if you look at how al-Awlaki presented ideas and created meaning, he did so using methods, whether probably not realizing it, methods that are very tried and tested into influential movements. And that's one of the things al-Awlaki wanted to do as well, to move beyond al-Qaeda, the organization, to say, actually, there's a wider movement out here. Al-Qaeda, the organization, may collapse. We want to create a social movement that can survive organizational collapse and is dependent on ideas and their presentation. So the book essentially explains how al-Awlaki follows very similar methods that all sorts of social movement actors do. And I refer to as a social movement entrepreneurs who take on the responsibility of transmitting that movement's ideas to a specific, and he was very, very effective at doing that. And the book kind of explains how he follows very key steps. You know, a big part of that, a big part of any social movement, the idea is the creation of a collective identity, being able to offer to your audience the opportunity to feel part of something bigger than themselves. And in fact, to relegate individual identity as something cheap, selfish, the idea that you should really care about the self is presented as this kind of waste of time. And actually, and you know, fascist movements do this a lot. And there's a book I note in the introduction, The True Believer, in which he says, you know, it's for people for whom the self they've given up on, and they're looking for something more. al-Awlaki was able to, through the storytelling, particularly that I mentioned, he was able to create a shared narrative, a shared history, and shared experiences that people could feel all part of. And once you do that, once you get people to have that shared collective identity, it's one of the first steps towards getting them to act on behalf of that collective. And again, the book goes in a lot of detail.
Before we turn to questions, I'm sorry we have to speed along, but you do a terrific job of analyzing three particular cases of you know, Muslims in the West, or you know, two in America and one in Nigeria, who were deeply influenced by this guy and lured into jihadism by him. So why don't we talk about these three? Maybe we'll do them in the order of the depths that they went to in the jihadist movement. So let's start with Zack Chesser, who I think stands for a lot of people. Tell us about Zack Chesser.
Yeah, so the book, once it goes over the al-Awlaki intellectual history, it moves on to trying to get a sense of how exactly he impacted people and when and why. And there's three chapters. The first is on Zack Chesser, who is a very well-known case for those of you who follow this stuff closely. And I basically chose three case studies on the basis of each of them represented three different types of kind of jihadist mobilization and activism in the West. Zack Chesser represented the classic example of someone who started online, took on the role of becoming an online propagandist, a jihadist, a term coined long ago, and someone who took it on as their job to disseminate propaganda online, but for whom then that started feeling like it wasn't enough, and who wanted to make the upgrade to the real world and become an activist. He tried to join al-Shabaab, again influenced heavily by al-Awlaki at the time, and arrested on his way to do that, spending, I think, much of the rest of his life in jail here in the U.S. The key things about Chesser, you know, are, you know, one of the first times you see him is on al-Awlaki's blog that al-Awlaki sets up in Yemen. And he's one of the commenters on the blog, and you can trace Chesser's own development from this young, curious, recent convert to Islam to jihadist. And he's actually a really great example of strategically what al-Awlaki was trying to do in his al-Qaeda years, which is one of the key things al-Awlaki really did, along with Samir Khan and AQAP, was strategically, they said, look, let's lower the bar for what it means to be involved in this movement. Let's make it, you know, before that, the idea was the way you get involved in global jihad is you got to get up, travel to some hell somewhere and become a professional terrorist on the AFPAC border or somewhere in East Africa or something. That was the idea. You could only be legit if that's what you were doing. What al-Awlaki came out and said essentially was actually, no, if you get online and start disseminating or creating propaganda, you're also part of the movement. When you lower the bar for involvement, what you do is you allow a lot more people in, and you create a lot more potential for those people to start at that low rung of online activism and slowly work their way up towards.
So another one of your chapters, your case studies, is Nidal Hassan, the Army psychiatrist who opened fire at Fort Hood in 2009. So that was a guy who didn't have to go to the Afghan-Pak border, you know, was able to carry out jihad at home as al-Awlaki was telling him to do, right?
Yeah, and so the book kind of identifies moments in these people's lives where they were experiencing some kind of vulnerability, some kind of unease or questioning of their own identity and themselves. And for Chesser, it was his conversion to Islam, full stop, was the kind of moment that someone could take advantage of. Nidal Hassan, interestingly, it was the death of his mother, actually, that first sparked this, sparked a new interest in Islam. And in fact, al-Awlaki presided over his mother's funeral, we later find out. And it was the first time he came across him, and he stuck in his mind. And one of the key things to keep in mind with all these guys is when you ask, and in fact, I was lucky enough to be involved with an interview with Nidal Hasan, a colleague of mine who published an excellent study for the program on extremism, based on the interviews, was very kind to let me take some part in it, and also she shared with me some unpublished interviews that I use in the book. And when you ask him what are the works of al-Awlaki that are most important to him, it's, this is a guy who conducted a mass shooting. It's not the jihadist stuff; it's the early stuff. And this is the thing to keep in mind with all these guys: is they love al-Awlaki because of all the other Islam stuff he was doing. Yes, the jihad stuff was useful and was very important, but if you ask them what their favorite stuff is, it's almost always life of the prophets or the life of Muhammad. And same with Hassan. And Hassan also explains how al-Awlaki helped him understand that the war on Islam was not just a physical, violent effort involving the dropping of bombs in the Middle East. There was an ideological effort happening in the West to destroy Islam. So it allowed people to identify a war on Islam on their doorstep, in their backyard, giving that immediate sense of threat to them. And when you offer that kind of immediacy, you've got a much bigger chance of getting people involved than saying, well, this is war on Islam happening thousands of miles away. So he was very good. And so for Hassan, even though al-Awlaki never specifically told him to conduct the attack, and actually al-Awlaki doesn't seem was involved planning-wise, and Hassan's understanding of Islam was entirely shaped by al-Awlaki's work, both the early stuff and the later.
But of course, famously, right after that shooting, al-Awlaki came to most Americans' attention when he wrote on his blog, Nidal Hasan is a hero. And suddenly there was this guy who'd been an imam in America saying in English on a much-read blog that this guy was a hero. And I think that was the first time that many of us, including me, really took an interest in Anwar al-Awlaki. And so before we get to the questions, your third case study is Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the so-called underwear bomber, the Christmas Day bomber, in 2009, who tried to blow up that airliner over Detroit. So tell us about him. He actually did decide to leave home and go to Yemen, right?
Yeah, so with Chesser, we have the online activist who tries to become a foreign fighter. He wants to go to al-Shabaab and help them. With Hassan, you've got the classic lone actor, not connected to anyone, influenced by things he's seeing online and reading, and al-Awlaki indirectly. And then you have the pro-terrorist. You have the guy who does it the old-fashioned way, goes to the actual terrorist organization, tries to get the training. Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the chapter covers a lot of his time in the UK. So I've already described what the UK activism in the UK looked like at the time. That's kind of how it looked when Abdul Muttalib was at university at LSE in London. And in fact, he was the president of the Islamic Society of LSE and was a member of the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, the organization I read that statement from. So this is the milieu he was in. He was in a milieu of people who were basically Islamist activists and who idolized al-Awlaki. And in fact, I found was part of it that helped the chapter was I think documents you got released by the FBI through FOI. I think the New York Times had to sue for them in the end, and they were all on the website. The FOI request on the interviews that Abdul Muttalib gave after his arrest. And a lot of really interesting information in that, which helped me shape it all together. And one of the things he says is when he was in London was all the Islamic Society members, all his friends, all his people he's involved with were all major al-Awlaki fans. And as well as a number of organizations he was a fan of, including a group called Cage Prisoners, who are still quite well known today, founded by a former Guantanamo Bay inmate. And the reasons why he decided and the others didn't to actually go to Yemen and meet him and be trained by him are very, very hard to completely understand. But what's important is that he was, to some extent, what's important to know is that he was to some extent a product of what was going on in the UK at the time. And al-Awlaki was his door, his access to the jihad movement. He goes to Yemen through a number of ways that I describe in the book, manages to actually go meet al-Awlaki, is recruited, is trained, is provided with the bomb, and attempts to set that off on Christmas Day over Detroit. And there's a lot in the book that explains exactly how and why al-Awlaki was so important to him. And really this was a boy who was very, he was a Salafi. He was very well read up on it. He could pretty much recite the Quran. This was a person who really was very religious as well.
Terrific. So why don't we go to questions now? We have 22 questions, including a lot of great questions. And by the way, we've been given permission to go beyond noon for a while. So we'll get in as many of these questions as we can. Some are big and broad, some are pretty quick. I'll start with a quick one. When in the UK, if ever, did al-Awlaki ever come across Anjem Chowdhury, the another extremist character who folks may know about?
That's a good question. Strangely enough, al-Awlaki's time in the UK kind of just about predates Chowdhury as a figure. In the end, al-Muhajirun, the organization that Chowdhury was the head of, was itself an offshoot of Hizb ut-Tahrir, a sort of political Islamist activist group in the UK. And I know that Hizb ut-Tahrir had a relationship with al-Awlaki, and were competing along with a number of other Islamic groups there for his attention and his praise. And I spoke to a former senior member of HT, Hizb ut-Tahrir at the time, so the organization that preceded Chowdhury's, who said that, in the end, they had very little to disagree with on al-Awlaki, and they saw him as a very useful figure because he was a supporter of setting up a caliphate, which is what the HT sort of casus belli is. And so in the end, they were very similar figures, though I think Chowdhury was a kind of less serious, slightly more narcissistic, in my view, than al-Awlaki, but that's more personal view than anything else.
Was al-Awlaki ever employed by the Saudi embassy while he was preaching at Dar al-Hijra in Falls Church?
Not that I know of. And in fact, one of the things to keep in mind, speaking of Saudi state, and is, one of the things I say and explain in the book is al-Awlaki doesn't really have much in the form of formal training in the way that other Salafi preachers in the US did. Guys like Ali al-Tamimi had gone and trained at Saudi universities for years and years and years, who were, serious scholars. Al-Awlaki was not a serious scholar. He presented as such, but actually very little of his work contained any kind of in-depth academic discussion. And for that reason, he was so much more accessible than all these other sheikhs, because he was asking very little of his audience other than to sit and listen and be enraptured by this stuff. There was no study or discussions involved. And so he spent some time in Saudi Arabia, he claims, but no official, he didn't receive any official qualifications there.
We can't blame him.
And no, not an employee as far as I know.
So tell us about the nature, your view of the nature of the relationship with the 9/11 hijackers, with whom he had contact both in San Diego and later in Falls Church, Virginia.
It's still
there's been some speculation that maybe he was somehow in on the plot. What do you think about that?
And I know you addressed this in your book too, and I think we're of the same mind, is that it's still one of those big questions. And you read the 9/11 Commission report, and they're not convinced that he had nothing to do with it. I think you can see in there. There's still some big question mark. In the end, it's actually the San Diego one is a bit stranger, because the two hijackers who joined him in San Diego, the mosque he was at in San Diego was not the mosque you go to if you don't know the city. It was a mosque in a pretty bad part of town. You had to really know it. Someone had to have told you to go there. If you were just visiting the city at the time, you would have gone to the main mosque there.
So
this
they
was
were
not
sent.
Well, this is the things that come up well, who told them to go there? And then, of course, not only that, he then goes across the country to Virginia, and they go there. They end up at the same mosque again. I don't think al-Awlaki had an involvement in 9/11. And as we've discussed in the past, Scott, we said that, had he done, he would have admitted it later on when he was an open member of al-Qaeda. When he had nothing to lose and he was looking to gain credibility, he would have taken credit for knowing something about 9/11. He never did. My one thought is perhaps when they were sent to the United States, people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the guys who were managing them and telling them where to go and what to do may have scoped out this sort of the scene of American Islam at the time and had a look at al-Awlaki's work and said, actually, this guy, he's not a jihadist. He's not openly calling for jihad. He's also not an apostate. He's not kafir. He's not saying things that we disagree with, really, either. The type of Islam he was preaching was one that would not have swayed the views of those guys when they went. They wouldn't have wanted to send them to a preacher who maybe would have completely convinced them that jihadism is wrong. Al-Awlaki was not the guy who was going to do that. And in fact, at the very least, at the time, he was glorifying jihad in ancient time, in the early Islamic times. So I have a feeling they maybe had a look and said, look, this guy, he's not going to do any harm. He may even bolster their emotional connection to it all. But really, it's just a speculation.
Yeah.
Though again, I don't think he was actually involved or knew anything.
Yeah. I mean, Untitled Sheikh Mohammed, as everyone knows, was the main plotter of the 9/11 attacks, and he was a guy who'd gone to college in this country as well. He had studied in North Carolina, and so he had a sense, a little bit of the scene here. And it could be that there was a chain of connections where they, without revealing any of the plot, of course, because I think the last person that a guy like college Sheikh Mohammed would have trusted was a guy like al-Awlaki, who was American by birth and had spent so long here. For all they knew, he was an FBI informant or something. So they wouldn't trust him with the plot, I don't think. But they might have sensed a sort of hospitable, helpful guy who was fluent in Arabic and fluent in English and could help them out, as he seems to have done, at least in terms of their living arrangements and so on. So we have a question here. How would you characterize al-Awlaki's operational role in AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in physically organizing rather than inspiring attacks? And of course, I should say that this was the crucial distinction when President Obama ended up putting al-Awlaki on the kill list. He did that because he essentially based that on evidence that he had become an operational terrorist. He was not just an ideologue. He was actually participating in terrorist attacks, including, of course, sending Abdul Muttalib, as you mentioned, the underwear bomber, to attack the U.S. Mm-hmm. So what was his operational role in your understanding of AQAP?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, not to say that the person asking the question has this misconception, but there is a misconception out there that al-Awlaki was killed by the U.S. government because of what he was saying. Exactly. Jeremy Scahill, in a I think actually quite a good book, Dirty Wars, makes this kind of claim about al-Awlaki, that al-Awlaki was killed because he was saying things that we didn't like. And it's like, overall, the book is a very good critique of the use of special forces. And in fact, the thing about Scahill, though, is he actually relies quite heavily on my early work in al-Awlaki to make all these points. But he ignores the fact that I also say al-Awlaki was operational. And this is why and Scahill decides not to address that. The fact is, yes, we know the Abdul Muttalib case was the first one we knew of at the time, where he had a very direct hand in terms of target selection, weapon procurement, bomb procurement. He connected him with Ibrahim al-Asiri, the famous AQAP bomb maker. He was the main man behind that plot. The moment he did that, he met the criteria, I'd say, of whatever you think of the kill list Obama had. He certainly met the criteria for it. The book also lays out a number of other lesser known plots al-Awlaki was directly involved with, including a young Nigerian who went to join him in Yemen, who then plotted to go back to Nigeria and recruit more members and even maybe plot a terrorist attack in Nigeria. We also know now that he was directly involved with the Kouachi brothers, who went and murdered the staff at the Charlie Hebdo offices, the satirical magazine in Paris. He directed one of the brothers and gave him money to go and commit that attack. So that's, and there's still an idea out there that al-Awlaki was killed because of what he was saying. No, I mean, that's what got people's attention. But al-Awlaki met the criteria to be assassinated, whatever we think of that policy, through his direct operational involvement, and not just operate strategically. Yes. And this has been made a lot at this point, but we now see one of the ways that the jihad movement attacks the West is through lone actor attacks. That's kind of accepted as one of the ways it looks today. Let's not forget that al-Awlaki was kind of him and Samir Khan, maybe Samir Khan even more than al-Awlaki, were really one of the first people behind that idea, an idea that wasn't all that popular for al-Qaeda at the time. Guys like bin Laden didn't like the idea of the lone actor attacks. They thought it was unedifying. They thought it would mean they'd lose control of the movement. Eventually, al-Qaeda embraced the lone actor model, I think, largely thanks to al-Awlaki. And one thing I always tell to my students, as far as his impact strategically, today, I'll give you the story that one of the chapters opens up on. In London, a couple of years ago, on Exhibition Road, it's the road outside the Natural History Museum, a car jumped the curb and hit a few people and hits the news immediately and gets everyone's attention. Why? Well, because somewhere in our minds, there's a thought of maybe this is a terrorist attack. Very soon after the event happens, the police feel compelled to announce that it's not being treated as terrorism related. Isn't that a term you hear all the time now? There's been a knifing, there's been a shooting, there's been a car jump the curb in the middle of a city. It's not being treated as terrorism related. That's not how life used to be. And I tell this to my students, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that's not where our minds went when some random act of violence happened. That is where our minds go now. Well, many people, to the point where the police, this story I told you is one which you've probably heard in other versions of, in Times Square or whatever. That's al-Awlaki's job. Al-Awlaki did that to some extent. He created it so that, yes, the attacks that did take place, the vehicle attacks and the stabbings, were low impact casualty wise, but they kept the movement in our minds. They kept it at the forefront of our minds. In fact, and really, if you're a terrorist and you're using terrorism as propaganda, which is really what it is, the main thing you want to do is, okay, you want to kill a lot of people, but that's actually usually not the main goal. It's keep the attention of your adversaries, keep the attention of your potential recruits. And the lone actor model that al-Awlaki developed really did that, to the point where now we're doing the propaganda for them by having to even address the fact that someone jumping the curb, and needless to say, it was not a terrorist attack in London on Exhibition Road. Someone jumping the curb on Exhibition Road reminds us of al-Qaeda all over again. And that every time that happens, they've had a success.
The root of terrorism, the word terrorism, I always like to remember, is to cause to tremble. And with pinprick attacks in many cases in the post 9/11 years, these jihadist groups have managed to keep people on edge and to sort of see them as major players. So here's a quick one. By the way, we're past noon now, but we're allowed to go on for a while. So we'll go on for another 15 or 20 minutes at least. So we have a lot of great questions to tackle here. A quick one: what evidence is there that Inspire magazine, which for those who don't know is was the extremely influential English language magazine of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, what evidence is there that the Inspire magazine was the brainchild of al-Awlaki, and that he was the editor? I see this claimed a lot. Is that true?
In short, yes, but there's a longer story. Again, Samir Khan, who was basically an American Saudi from Charlotte, who basically went over to Yemen to join al-Awlaki at AQAP, probably doesn't get enough credit. And I wish I could have done more with him in the book, but it's probably a book to be written about him. Anyone out there he's a very important figure. And it may well be actually Samir Khan was more important to Inspire, because Inspire, and again, I cover this in the book, interviews with people like Jesse Morton, who were very important jihadi activists in America in the 2000s. There's a predecessor magazine to Inspire, which is called Jihadi Recollections, which was written, and it looks, if you can look it up, it looks exactly the same as Inspire. It's a little bit rough around the edges, but it was developed in the United States by Samir Khan and by guys like Jesse Morton, who I spoke to and who said to me that al-Awlaki was actually involved with Jihad Recollections, which is something I didn't know until I spoke to Jesse about it. And so he was giving instruction to Samir Khan back when he still lived in America in the mid-2000s about what Jihad Recollections should contain. So it was a brainchild of people like Samir Khan, Jesse Morton, al-Awlaki. Al-Awlaki was the guy who made it popular, the face of it, the guy who they needed to drive it. But I think a lot of the strategic thinking and the presentation of it, I think a lot of that had to do with Samir Khan. But either way, yes, al-Awlaki was very involved with it and wrote articles either under his own name and also, we think, as a pseudonym.
He was sort of the patron, at least at that time, even, kind of the honorary editor-in-chief or something, right?
Yes, yeah. And one of the things al-Awlaki was keen, and so Jihad Recollections, one of the story Jesse tells me that's in the book is he wrote an article with Jihad Recollections saying that actually we should reshift our focus to the far enemy, meaning, or rather, actually, so the near enemy. So without getting too much into that, he essentially was saying we should stop attacking America and go back to attacking the secular leaders in the Arab world. That should be al-Qaeda's goal. Al-Awlaki reprimands him for this and says, no, we need to be focusing on America. So really, even then, he was very keen to keep the focus there.
Uh-huh. So we have a number of questions that sort of circle around the transformation of Anwar al-Awlaki from, more or less mainstream, acceptable American imam. He famously was invited after 9/11 to speak at the Pentagon, give a luncheon speech at the Pentagon. You don't get a whole lot more mainstream than that.
No.
To a leader of al-Qaeda. What do you think made, what were the key factors in driving that change? Do you point to any external event, any internal event in his life? Do you really think it was sort of an unveiling of views that he had all along but kept to himself? What drives him to change, at least in external appearance, so radically?
So I don't have a definitive answer. Again, it's, part of it has to be how I've derived, from the analysis. But one of the first things I noted and is clear in the book is that there was a clear Islamist influence in his work early on. Now that is not, the vast majority of people with those ideas don't become jihadists. So that's not on its own enough. But what it means is that before 9/11 happened, before the war on terror, he had a view of the world that, as I said, was pretty straightforward. It was, there's the Muslim world, there's the Muslims, and then there's the rest of the world. And the rest of the world, particularly the United States, presents us with a great threat and puts us in great peril as Muslims. So that was already the view. He also had a very kind of romantic view of jihad, including the jihads being fought in Israel, Palestine, including in Chechnya and all. So he had this sort of glorified vision of what jihad looked like. And as I said, I place him somewhere in the spectrum of Salafism as an activist Salafi. So these are Salafis, as I said, whose views and whose methodology in particular is impacted by geopolitical shifts. They can change from saying don't fight jihad to saying fight jihad on the basis of an invasion or a political moment in a way that other Salafis don't. So when 9/11 happened, the frame through which you viewed the world was shaped very much by Islamist, Salafi-infused Islamist ideology. So it allowed him to take steps and sort of ideological strides towards more open support for jihad without a huge break from his previous belief. As I say in the book, if you look at his work in 2010 when he's writing and inspiring, you look at his work in 99 or 98, there's actually not a huge difference as far as the sources he relies on. It's just the emphasis that he puts on. And what is really important is his view on how Muslims should react to these threats. Initially, it was react through peaceful activism, protests, everything else. And that eventually became hardened into react with violent jihad. In his view, in his words, he says, look, I did that because I began with activism and I got to the point where I believed that the situation was so dire for Muslims that activism was not enough. Violence had to be. And that's actually a common story among terrorists that you'll hear. They started with different, sort of lower form, lower risk activism, and they moved to higher risk when they realized they thought it wasn't working. So pre-existing Islamist sympathies was a big part. 9/11, the world changing event, especially for Muslims in the West, cannot be ignored. He certainly, it seems, was threatened by the FBI, or at least, he knew the FBI had dirt on him, including his involvement with prostitutes in the United States in the 90s, which they may have threatened him with and said, look, if you don't cooperate with us and perhaps become an informant, we will publicize this. And a lot of people put that moment down as a major moment in his radicalization, that he was forced to leave America. All his options, reduced down to jihad, which is a bit simplistic, but yes, there's a component of that. Others like to put a lot of importance on his imprisonment in Yemen. They say, like other Islamists, he became a much more hardcore jihadist because of his experiences in prison. I don't want to discount it, but let's not forget, he'd already translated and endorsed Constance in the Path of Jihad in 2005 before he went to prison. So actually, the only real change when he came out of prison was a slightly more, strident support and immediate support for jihad, but it was already there. And again, I throughout the analysis of his early work, I point out a couple of flags there, red flags that I think really suggest that this guy was already playing with some ideas in jihadism. It was certainly sympathetic to them. So it was this combination of things, as usual. Anyone who wants to give you a straight answer and a very straightforward and simple answer about how someone becomes radicalized, I would advise you to be careful, because there's a reason they're usually doing that. What the book says is, look, there are ideological reasons, there are personal experiences, and there are external geopolitical factors that combine in this very unique moment. In 2001, it just turned out that al-Awlaki was where he was at the time. And all these things, serendipity has a role to play in all this as well, timing.
So let me I'll combine a couple of questions. Someone asked, why is al-Awlaki so prominent in al-Shabaab's propaganda?
Mm.
And a slightly different question, which is, can you please comment on the incongruity of the post-mortem adoption of al-Awlaki and his narrative by ISIS's media wing and fanboys? While so many other prominent al-Qaeda ideologies have been broadly condemned by ISIS, there's been a repeated embrace of al-Awlaki and co-optation of his brand that continues in ISIS media.
Yeah,
So this is sort of the posthumous, reputation and use of al-Awlaki.
Yeah, both related and very good questions, but from people who know what they're talking about clearly.
We have a sophisticated audience here.
Yeah, I'll start with look. There's a whole chapter. The last chapter is about al-Awlaki's posthumous influence, and one that I place a lot of. And I'm sure there'll be debate about this, but I put a lot of, I give a lot of credit to al-Awlaki for the success ISIS had in the West. And I think it's something you've written about as well, Scott. A couple of things to keep in mind. So, firstly, when ISI was established, the Islamic State in Iraq in 2006, the Zarqawi kind of, and early Baghdadi, not Abu Bakr, when they set up ISI in 2006, of course, there was a lot of controversy about this. Al-Qaeda were not entirely sure about it. And there was all these discussions internally. Al-Awlaki really openly, in 2006, heaped praise on the establishment of the Islamic State of Iraq, so the predecessor of ISIS. And one of the reasons a couple of reasons he praised them. One is because he said, we have a great example of theory turning to praxis. They are taking the ideas and they are implementing them, and they are setting up an Islamic State. This is such an important example. The other thing that he says, and that's really important, is that he notes that he said this is the first step towards the end of days. Where this is happening geographically is a sign that we have taken another major step towards fulfilling the prophecy in the Quran and the Hadith of the end of days happening in this part of the world. And that might sound familiar to people who know about ISIS, because that was one of the key ISIS messages. Will McCants' book ISIS Apocalypse talks about this sort of the apocalyptic nature of the ideology and the attraction of that. The attraction of saying that actually you can't just wait around anymore. If you want to be part of the jihad movement, if you want to make the right steps as a Muslim, you can't wait anymore. The caliphate's established, it's here, you have to protect it, and you have to be involved with the next phase. The train essentially is leaving the station now. It added the ISIS message of this kind of apocalyptic component of their activism was very attractive, partly because of this added immediacy. It said, you got to do it now. Al-Awlaki identified that in 2006, and he said the very same things that ISIS now saying, which is, this is now your opportunity. If you die anytime soon and you're asked, what did you do for the Ummah, and you didn't take the chance to be part of this most important moment in this history of Islam, then you're not going to go to heaven. And so Al-Awlaki, before Al-Qaeda really embraced and really never, Al-Qaeda weren't big on the whole end of days stuff and Dabiq and the final battle between good and evil. They weren't so keen on it. Al-Awlaki and a couple of others, not many, really saw the recruitment value in that message. So that's important. So when ISIS were founded, again, this is in the book, when they were founded, when they started reaching out to Westerners in English, one of the very, very first videos that they do is a voiceover of Al-Awlaki giving this 2006 speech and praising the establishment of ISI, and then saying things that were basically exactly the same as what ISIS is saying. So he was very important in that way. He's one of the only, he's mentioned in a couple in Dabiq, and I think Rumiyah, but certainly Dabiq. He's mentioned in ways that people like Zawahiri are not. They've managed to kind of keep him on board because they recognize this guy's so important to our Western audience. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He's too important. And all the outreach they do to Westerners is very, very influenced by him. And there's a concept that ISIS used to attract and to kind of create a sort of identity crisis among Western Muslims, and they call it the gray. They refer to the gray zone or the gray area, and they say, or they actually ISIS say gray zone, and they say in the United States, in the West, Muslims occupy the gray zone, this area between right and wrong, between the West and Islam, where we're fighting. There's a clear war taking place. And there's this gray area where all these Western Muslims are, where they haven't decided, they haven't taken a side, they're sitting on the fence. Our job as a terrorist group is to force that decision on them through acts of violence, to shrink the gray zone, to make it impossible for Muslims to no longer make their minds up. Because more than anything else, extremists want you to make your mind up. They don't care necessarily what side you choose. They just need you to choose a side so we can get on with cleaning, sorting everything out. And al-Awlaki was very much saying this stuff back then. In fact, the term gray zone, which for those close ISIS watchers may be familiar with, was coined by al-Awlaki in something like 2008. He said, there's no gray area here for Muslims anymore. ISI is established. There is no gray area for you. You cannot occupy that anymore. ISIS, they call it gray zone, but it's the exact language. Same, every component of the outreach to Westerners in particular, really, I think was taken from al-Awlaki.
Yeah, al-Awlaki,
most of it.
Once I remember, al-Awlaki actually echoes practically George W. Bush saying, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." That's essentially Muslims were getting the same message from two sides, that you have to pick sides. So we could go on for another 2 hours, but let me ask you a couple of big questions to wrap up here. One would be, a bunch of people have asked essentially about successors to al-Awlaki. Do you see anyone out there who is in the, either in the jihadist realm or in the kind of activist Salafi realm, heading in the direction of jihad? What is this just a huge vacuum that he left, or are there people stepping up to fill that vacuum?
Yeah, that's a very common question I get. A hard one to answer. What I would say is I don't think you can replicate the al-Awlaki story. As I said, he is a product of all this confluence of things, from his pre-9/11 preaching to 9/11 itself to the huge following he had before 9/11. So you're not going to get another al-Awlaki in the sense that you're not going to get a guy who was a senior member of one of the most important mosques in the West, in the United States, go from that to becoming a head of al-Qaeda. That move is not probably going to happen again. And so you're not going to be able to do what al-Awlaki did, which is build a huge base of mainstream Muslim support and then move to jihadism and take a lot of that base with you. That's very unlikely to happen again. Having said all that, there are people who certainly have tried. There are a lot of members of al-Muhajirun who've tried to kind of do. They don't have anywhere near the charisma or the credibility, because again, don't forget, al-Awlaki had this. He was considered a mainstream scholar, even though I wouldn't call him a scholar. He was considered that. So they don't have that. I would say the closest I've seen is probably Ahmed Musa Jibril, who comes up in a lot of ISIS cases. He's a U.S. resident. He lives there now freely. He features actually not so much in this book, but other things I've written for the program on extremism. There's a report I wrote called Salafism in America, which covers Jibril. And he's probably the closest. But again, Ahmed Musa Jibril was a jihadist in the late 90s. He was a supporter of, the early al-Qaeda operations before 9/11. So he's not. It's not like he's still got only a pretty narrow scope of support. But so I don't think there'll be another al-Awlaki because you can't recreate those circumstances. Mm-hmm. But you'll have people like Jibril who still have that ability to take what they know about American culture and psyche and fears and knowledge and experience and use it to create an attractive jihadist narrative.
So I'll use moderator's privilege to ask a question myself as the last one. And it's one that I was often asked, and it's one without a real clear-cut answer, I think, but it's an interesting one. In addition to becoming the leading spokesperson voice for al-Qaeda in English, Anwar al-Awlaki had another historic distinction, which was, of course, to become the first U.S. citizen deliberately hunted down and killed without criminal charges, without a trial, essentially executed by the U.S. government when Obama put him on the kill list. And eventually, on September 30th, 2011, they caught up with him in Yemen and killed him and 3 other guys with, Samir Khan was one of them, with a missile. Was that a good idea or a bad idea? I mean, I should just preface it by saying that as I was writing about this guy at the time, I saw his YouTube videos and tributes to him, flourish and grow at a very rapid pace after his death. And of course, there were many attacks in the West after his death, where the attackers specifically, it turned out, had been strongly influenced by him. So was it a good idea to take him off the field in terms of being an operational terrorist? Was it a bad idea to enhance his status with martyrdom?
Yeah, well, so al-Awlaki famously quotes Qutb about this and says, our influence or our work is written in our blood. And speaking of Qutb, he said, Qutb's martyrdom is what gave him extra strength. And al-Awlaki had some similar belief in that. It was, I think, the second attempt to kill him as well. Look, I don't think I veer towards, if you ask me simply, is it a good idea or a bad idea, I veer towards a good idea, though I wouldn't put it in those terms. But firstly, obviously, any assassination like that has to be taken very seriously, has to not be sort of necessarily celebrated or chest thumped about, or it's a very important and it's a decision that is not an easy one to make. I think that with his assassination, you had a couple of things that al-Qaeda lost. Firstly, I'll talk about that, and then what perhaps they gained. What they lost was, one, the fact that he was this magnet. So don't forget, in many cases, you weren't talking about people who were just looking for the opportunity to fight jihad. You're talking about people who were looking for al-Awlaki. Abdul Muttalib was one of them, but there's a number of other cases where they thought, if I meet al-Awlaki, if I speak to al-Awlaki, that's the next step I need. And there's a case of a British Airways employee who I cover here and whose emails I had with al-Awlaki, where they discussed, where they are talking, and they ended up, basically, he's a British Airways employee at Heathrow, and he's offering to help al-Awlaki plan a terrorist attack there. And what you realize is just their engagement with him was what made them fully decide, okay, I'm ready to commit this attack. So he was a magnet for anyone who was interested, and they took away that magnet, and it didn't really ever get replaced. So I think there was probably a lot of people who just kind of threw in the towel after that, though I can only speculate. So they lost the person who was this direct, influence for people's decision to go from, sympathizer of jihad to actual jihadists. Also, what al-Awlaki was engaged with a lot at the time was, through Inspire and through his online speeches, was he was able to constantly offer the jihadist spin or narrative on new events. And this is a very important resource that al-Awlaki provided Western jihadis was, okay, the news is saying this about the 2008 financial crash. The news is saying this about the Muhammad cartoons. The news is saying this about the Arab Spring. Yeah. What is al-Qaeda's take on this? What's the al-Qaeda news take on this? And al-Awlaki was providing that for Westerners. He was able to kind of weave in the usual narratives, but take examples from new moments and make them relevant. They lost that too when he died. And so I think on balance, I think they lost more than they gained, but it's a counterfactual. We don't know if he stayed alive what the difference would be. What we do know is when he was alive, he was a magnet for a lot of Westerners who were looking for him specifically in order to be able to commit an attack. And we know that he was very important in this constant propaganda production. They lost that. In terms of what they gained the opportunity to say, look, yes, you've martyred one of our most important preachers, and they were able to say, look, as soon as you call people to Islam, you're going to get killed by the U.S. government. And this is the kind of, sort of not very convincing claim they made. But so I think that's kind of the key thing to keep in mind is you got to think about what they gained and lost. Whether or not, the other thing to keep in mind, he'd said everything he needed to say by the time he was killed. So as far as justifying jihad, making it relevant to Westerners, to an extent, everything he was saying up until after, in the years up to before he died, we're essentially rehashing of stuff he'd already said, but giving it a new sort of spin based on the news stories of the time. So he said everything he needed to say. And in that sense, maybe it wasn't a huge loss, but very hard to say. Overall, I lean towards it had to happen. You had a guy who was actively involved. If you were to put this on the table and say, look, here's a file, Mr. President, there's a guy who is actively involved in multiple plots, one of which very nearly pure luck is what stopped however many hundreds of people dying on that plane with Abdul Muttalib. And you have this guy who is connected to this amount of other plots right now. The problem is he lives in a part of Yemen where the government has no control. We can't ask the Yemeni police to go arrest him. There's no military who's going to go do that. He's living in essentially a lawless part of the world. So at that point, we have two options. We can go in and arrest him with the special forces team, or we leave him, or the three options: leave him, arrest him with the special forces, or kill him. And given how, if you think about the bin Laden operation, and more important figure, they decided to do an incredibly risky special forces operation that actually nearly goes horrifically wrong. That one of the two stealth Black Hawks went down, was crashed, and the site could have gone horribly wrong. So there's a lot of huge amount of risk and collateral damage when you send special forces in. In fact, they did it later on at an AQAP base under the Trump administration, ended up killing al-Awlaki's young daughter, and it was one of a number of tragic stories around the al-Awlaki family. So in a way, a precision strike on a bunch of known terrorist operators in a jeep in the Shabwa deserts was actually maybe the lowest risk option. Now there's also the legal question, which I can't really address, the international law question. And I'm sure there's international lawyers there who can tell me this is an illegal act. Probably a few who can tell me it's a legal act too, because international law can be interpreted in many ways.
So that's a great answer. I think we're going to get kicked off of Zoom here in a minute. So I'll just say that if you still have questions, Alex is not hard to find at George Washington on the program on extremism. You can find my email on my Twitter page. And this has been a real pleasure hosting Alex. Everybody, as soon as you get off, of course, if you haven't already done it, order the book Incitement, Anwar al-Awlaki's Western Jihad. And thanks again to GW for inviting me, and thanks to Alex for giving us a terrific talk here.
Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I'm on Twitter, @Hitchens. Any questions, anything else, feel free. Thank you.
Okay. Signing out.